The mind behind the weapon. The Tavor, TAR-21 and the architects who rethought urban combat. The workshop air in Ramat Hasharon tasted of metal shavings and disappointment. Half-light filtered through dust-filmed windows, catching the angles of a rifle that looked wrong, deliberately, defiantly wrong. Zalman Shebs stood with his hands flat on the workbench, palms against cold steel, watching 5 officers of the Israel Defense Forces examine the prototype with the careful politeness people reserve for disasters they're about to decline. The Tavor. 32 inches of polymer and controversy, a bullpup configuration, magazine behind the trigger group, that made the rifle as short as a submachine gun, but kept the accuracy of a full-length barrel. On paper, it solved everything. In this room, in November 1995, it looked like career suicide. Colonel Yaron Amit picked it up, turned it over, set it down without shouldering it. The sound of plastic meeting metal echoed louder than it should have. "You want our soldiers entering Nablus with this?" Shebs didn't answer immediately. He'd learned that silence carried more weight than defensiveness. But Baruch Lev, his ergonomic specialist, couldn't help himself. "It's 70 centimeters shorter than the M16 in confined spaces. Doorways, stairwells, vehicle interiors. It looks," Amit said slowly, "like something that would jam in the first magazine." The other officers murmured agreement. One, a major whose name Shebs hadn't caught, tapped the polymer receiver with a fingernail, as if checking for structural integrity through percussion. Outside, Tel Aviv traffic hummed its evening rhythm. Inside, the weight of institutional inertia pressed down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Shebs finally spoke. "In the last 4 years, we've lost 17 soldiers in close-quarters engagements where their primary weapon was too long to bring to bear before contact. Not equipment failures, not tactical errors. Length." The room went quiet. 17, he repeated, "that we know of. The ones where after-action reports were honest enough to say the M16 couldn't rotate in time." Amit's jaw tightened. Everyone in that room knew Shebs was right. They'd all read the same casualty reports from Gaza, from the southern Lebanese security zone, from the Warren-like streets of West Bank cities where the First Intifada had taught brutal lessons about urban combat. The M16A1, inherited from American doctrine, measured 39 inches overall. In a Jenin alleyway measuring 6 feet wall to wall, with a fighter emerging from a doorway at arm's length, those extra 7 inches were the difference between living and dying. But knowing a problem exists and betting careers on an unproven solution, those were different calculations. "We'll discuss it," Amit said. The phrase every engineer learns to translate as "no." After they left, the workshop settled into its familiar nighttime quiet. Adi Goldstein, the ballistics engineer, was running stress calculations at her desk in the corner. David Merrin examined polymer samples under harsh LED light, checking for microfractures. Lev cleaned the test barrel with methodical precision, as if ritual could transmute doubt into certainty. Shebs walked to the window. Outside, the city glowed. Somewhere out there, soldiers trained with weapons designed for different wars, for different enemies, for battlefields that offered room to maneuver. The future would be fought in living rooms and stairwells and 3-meter corridors. He knew that with the kind of certainty that keeps you awake at night. The kind that makes you mortgage your reputation on an idea everyone calls impossible. "They'll never approve it," Lev said quietly. "They will," Shebs replied, "when enough soldiers die that the numbers become louder than doctrine." It was a terrible thing to say. It was also true. The prototype sat on the workbench, its strange silhouette a promise or a threat, depending on who was looking. In 3 years, it would save lives in the bloodiest urban battle Israel had fought since 1948. But on that November evening in Ramat Hasharon, it was just a piece of polymer and steel that looked like failure to everyone who mattered. Shebs turned back to his calculations. The work continued. It always did, in the gap between what doctrine permitted and what reality demanded. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong but you know you're right, tell us in the comments and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you keep building something when every door closes in your face? Zalman Shebs learned about weapons the way most children learn about mortality, through sudden, irreversible loss. He was 21 in October 1973, when Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal on Yom Kippur. His tank unit, equipped with aging M48 Pattons, took up defensive positions in the Sinai. What the Israeli General Staff had called impregnable doctrine collapsed in 90 minutes. The Egyptians came with Saga anti-tank missiles that turned armor into coffins. Shebs's tank survived because their gunner had modified the targeting system against regulations. A homemade improvement that let them acquire targets 3 seconds faster than standard equipment allowed. 3 seconds. The crew next to them died because they followed doctrine. After the war, after the funerals, after the investigations that quietly buried uncomfortable questions about why Israeli equipment had underperformed so catastrophically, Shebs went to Technion in Haifa and studied mechanical engineering with the single-mindedness of someone who'd seen friends burn because the tools they were given didn't match the war they were fighting. His father, Avraham, had survived Auschwitz by repairing SS vehicles. When Shebs came home on leave during his studies, they would work together in the small machine shop behind the kibbutz garage. Avraham never talked about the camps directly, but his hands spoke a different language. Precision, improvisation, the knowledge that survival often came down to making something work when failure meant death. Problems don't solve themselves with prayers, Avraham would say, tightening a lathe clamp. They solve themselves with tools, and sometimes with better tools. By 1981, Shebs was working for Israel Military Industries, the state-owned defense manufacturer. His first assignment, improving the Galil assault rifle, Israel's attempt to replace the M16 with domestic production. He spent 3 years making incremental improvements, better sights, more reliable magazines, minor ergonomic adjustments, competent work, safe work, the kind of work that earned steady promotions and comfortable retirement. It made him miserable. The problem wasn't the Galil. The problem was that the Galil, like the M16, like every assault rifle designed since the Second World War, followed the same fundamental architecture. Magazine in front of trigger, long barrel, overall length optimized for open field combat. Nobody questioned it. It was simply how rifles were built. Then came the First Intifada. Starting in December 1987, Palestinian resistance shifted from organized militia actions to urban insurgency. Israeli soldiers found themselves fighting not in the open desert or the Golan Heights, but in the cramped streets of Gaza City, Nablus, Hebron, places where engagements happened at arm's length, where civilians complicated every tactical decision, where the M16's 39-inch length became a liability rather than an asset. The after-action reports accumulated on Shebs's desk. He read them late at night in his small apartment in Ramat Gan, marking passages with yellow highlighter. Unable to traverse weapon in stairwell before contact. Rifle muzzle exposed around corner before visual acquisition. Enemy used barrel position to predict movement. Transitioning between rooms required two-hand carry. Impossible to open doors while maintaining security. The pattern was unmistakable. The urban battlefield demanded a shorter weapon. But doctrine said short weapons meant either pistols, insufficient range and stopping power, or submachine guns, poor accuracy beyond 25 meters. The rifle, the backbone of infantry combat since the 1960s, was designed for a war that no longer existed. In April 1991, after a particularly deadly operation in southern Lebanon, where 3 soldiers were killed in a building clearing gone wrong, Shebs drafted a proposal. Handwritten, 14 pages, with technical schematics sketched in the margins. A bullpup rifle, moving the action and magazine behind the trigger group. allowing a full-length barrel in a drastically shorter overall package. He presented it to the IMI board on a Thursday morning. The conference room in Ramat Hasharon smelled of coffee and institutional skepticism. Director Moshe Dayan, no relation to the famous general, listened politely. Then the British tried bullpups with the EM2 in the 50s. The Austrians have the AUG. Neither has replaced conventional rifles in widespread service. "We're not the British," Sheb said. "We don't fight in the Falklands. We fight in Jenin, in Gaza, in places where 6 inches of extra length kills people. The concept isn't proven. It's proven enough. The problem is implementation. Ejection systems, balance, ambidextrous operation." "Zalman," Dayan interrupted, not unkindly. "We have production contracts, budget allocations. The IDF standardized on the M16 family. You're asking us to bet against 40 years of Western military doctrine. I'm asking you to bet on our soldiers not dying in stairwells." The meeting ended without approval. Shebs walked back to his desk through the IMI factory floor, past machinists building Galil rifles that would equip reserve units, past quality control stations testing weapons that worked perfectly for battles that weren't being fought anymore. That night, he called Baruch Lev. "I need help," he said. "Unofficial help." Lev was quiet for a moment. "This is the bullpup thing?" "Yes. They'll never approve it." "I know." Another pause. "When do we start?" The conspiracy began small. Lev handled ergonomics. David Merron, a materials engineer Shebs had worked with on the Galil project, agreed to source polymer components quietly. And Adi Goldstein, one of the few women in Israeli weapons design, brought expertise in terminal ballistics that would prove crucial. They worked after hours, using scrap materials, documenting nothing officially. In the culture of Israeli defense innovation, where improvisation was respected even when it violated protocol, this wasn't entirely unusual. But it wasn't safe either. If the project failed, it would be career-ending. If it succeeded without authorization, it might be worse. Shebs didn't care. He'd stopped caring the day he read a casualty report that described, in clinical language, how a 22-year-old corporal had been killed because his rifle was 7 inches too long to bring to bear before an assailant closed the distance in a neighbor's apartment building. 7 inches. In his small notebook, the one he kept in his workshop drawer, Shebs wrote a single line. "An inch can mean the difference between life and death. Every inch is worth fighting for." The work continued, in secret, against doctrine, against common sense, according to everyone who mattered, but in favor of soldiers who deserved tools that matched the wars they actually fought. The first prototype looked like an act of defiance welded into firearm form, January 1993. The workshop in Ramat Hasharon had taken on the character of a conspiracy. Lev arrived before dawn, Merron stayed past midnight, and Goldstein ran ballistics calculations on her home computer, printing reports that officially didn't exist. Shebs coordinated it all with the quiet intensity of someone building a cathedral in secret, knowing it might be demolished before the first stone was set. The weapon taking shape on their workbench violated every aesthetic principle of rifle design. The magazine well sat behind the pistol grip, making the rifle look backwards. The ejection port, designed to throw spent brass forward and to the right, required a completely novel gas system. The trigger mechanism needed to connect to an action 15 inches behind, where conventional wisdom said it should be, which meant rethinking how trigger pull translated into firing pinstrike. But the numbers didn't lie. Overall length, 72 centimeters. Barrel length, 46 centimeters. The same barrel length as an M16, packaged in a weapon 30% shorter. "If it works," Lev said one evening, squinting at the trigger assembly, "we'll have changed close-quarters doctrine forever." "If," Merron echoed. The test came on a cold February morning at a private range outside Ramat Hasharon. No official observers, no documentation, just the 4 of them and a prototype rifle wrapped in canvas like a secret that would destroy them if it escaped. Shebs loaded the first magazine himself, Israeli 5.56mm NATO, standard military issue. He shouldered the rifle, felt its strange balance, heavier in the rear, lighter in the front, the weight distribution completely different from anything he'd trained with in his army service. The first shot cracked across the range, the second shot burned his face. The ejection system, Goldstein's carefully calculated design, failed catastrophically. Spent brass and propellant gas vented directly into the shooter's face instead of safely away. Shebs dropped the rifle, stumbled backward, hands to his cheek where the skin was already blistering. Lev grabbed a medical kit. Merrin killed the firing line. Goldstein stood frozen, staring at the prototype lying in the dirt, smoke still curling from its ejection port. The dream, it seemed, had lasted exactly 2 shots. But later, much later, after they'd treated Shebs's burns, after they'd documented the failure in notebooks that would never see official review, Goldstein noticed something in the test footage. In the 3 seconds between the first successful shot and the catastrophic ejection failure, Shebs had rotated 180 degrees in a space measuring 1.2 meters across. The test range had a door-frame mock-up for shotgun training. In those 3 seconds, Shebs had acquired the target, fired, and rotated to face the opposite direction, all within a space where an M16 would have required a 3-point turn. "Look at this," she said, running the footage back. They watched in silence. The failure was undeniable, but so was the possibility. 3 seconds, Merrin said softly, "before it tried to kill you." 3 seconds, Shebs agreed, touching the bandage on his face, where we proved it could work. The distinction was crucial. Failure meant the design was wrong. Catastrophic partial success meant the design was right, but the implementation needed work. They started again. Spring 1993 bled into summer, into autumn. The ejection system was redesigned 4 times, the gas system 6. They burned through borrowed materials budget, calling in favors, trading expertise for components, operating in the grey economy of innovation that exists in any defense industry where official channels move too slowly for battlefield urgency. The Israeli military operations provided brutal counterpoint to their work. In July 1993, Operation Accountability in southern Lebanon produced casualty reports that read like indictments of conventional rifle length. In September, a Jenin raid resulted in 3 soldiers wounded because weapon transitions in close quarters took too long. Each report landed on Shebs's desk like an accusation. Meanwhile, the official channels remained closed. Shebs had submitted 3 formal proposals to the IDF Procurement Committee. All declined. The feedback was always professional, always polite, always final. Unproven technology, budgetary constraints, incompatibility with existing training infrastructure, insufficient evidence of tactical advantage. The last one made Shebs laugh bitterly. Insufficient evidence, as if the casualty reports weren't evidence enough. In November 1993, a younger engineer named Yoav Hassan approached Shebs in the IMI cafeteria. "I heard about what you're doing," he said quietly. Shebs tensed. If word had spread, if management knew about the unauthorized project. "I want to help," Hassan continued. "I was in Sayeret Matkal. I know what it's like clearing buildings with a rifle designed for open ground. It's not official," Shebs said carefully. "I know. If it fails, it could end careers. I know that too. But I also know that my friends are still dying because their weapons don't fit the spaces they're fighting in." Hassan became their manufacturing specialist, solving production problems that would matter only if the design ever made it past prototype stage. It was an act of faith, or perhaps recognition, that faith and engineering were different names for the same stubborn refusal to accept that impossible meant permanent. By late 1994, they had a second prototype. The ejection system worked. The trigger pull was smooth. The balance felt natural after minimal training. In unofficial tests, conducted at ranges where questions weren't asked and reports weren't filed, soldiers from combat units put rounds through targets with accuracy matching the M16, while maneuvering in spaces where the M16 couldn't physically rotate. Shebs prepared another proposal. This one included test data, photographic evidence, testimonials from serving soldiers who'd trained with the prototype. It was comprehensive, irrefutable, grounded in battlefield reality rather than theoretical objection. The IMI board reviewed it in February 1995. Director Diane listened to the entire presentation, examined the prototype, watched video footage of close-quarters manipulation tests, then delivered his verdict. This is impressive work, Zolman, truly, but the IDF isn't interested in replacing the M16 family. The logistics alone would be prohibitive. Training infrastructure, maintenance protocols, parts inventory. You're asking them to rebuild their entire small arms ecosystem. I'm asking them to stop losing soldiers to preventable equipment inadequacies. I understand, but my hands are tied. What Diane didn't say, what everyone in the room understood, was that Israeli defense policy was deeply intertwined with American strategic support. The M16 wasn't just a rifle. It was a symbol of alliance, a material link to U.S. military aid, a procurement decision made at levels far above technical merit. Challenging the M16 meant challenging relationships that kept F-15s flying and Patriot missiles deployed. Shebs walked out of that meeting knowing the technical battle was won, but the institutional war was just beginning. And Rethought, do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. What do you do when you've proven you're right, but nobody with power is listening? The years between 1995 and 2000 passed in a strange, suspended state. Continued development of a weapon nobody officially wanted, funded through budget irregularities and quiet support from officers who'd seen too many casualty reports. The Tavor existed in bureaucratic limbo, not approved, not forbidden, not quite secret, but never quite acknowledged. EMI management tolerated Shebs's obsession because it cost relatively little, and because, in the innovative culture of Israeli defense industry, shutting down creative engineering felt worse than letting it continue in the shadows. Shebs's personal life narrowed to the workshop and home. His wife, Rachel, a high school mathematics teacher, adapted to his absences with the weary patience of someone who'd married an obsessive. Their conversations grew shorter, more transactional. "You're going to miss Sarah's recital again," she said one Thursday evening. "I know, I'm sorry. You're always sorry, Zalman, but you're never there." He had no defense. She was right. But he also couldn't explain that every hour in the workshop felt like time stolen back from future casualties, lives saved in battles not yet fought. How do you weigh your daughter's piano recital against a soldier you'll never meet who might survive a nameless firefight because his rifle was 7 inches shorter? The moral mathematics of innovation are cruel. The team evolved. Lev developed chronic back problems from years hunched over CAD terminals and left for a teaching position at Technion. Meron shifted to civilian aerospace projects. But new engineers arrived, drawn by rumors of the impossible rifle being built in Workshop 3. The project became a proving ground for young talent who wanted to work on something that mattered, consequences be damned. They refined the Tavor through dozens of iterations. The X95 variant emerged, even more compact, optimized for vehicle crews and special operations. The trigger system was smoothed through 17 redesigns. The rail system for optics and accessories became modular, anticipating a future where customization would be standard. And they waited. In September 2000, the waiting ended. The Second Intifada erupted after Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount. What began as protests escalated into sustained armed conflict across the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli forces faced a nightmare scenario: urban combat in dense civilian populations against fighters who knew every alley and basement, every sightline and ambush position. The M16 casualties mounted immediately. The pattern was grimly familiar. Soldiers caught in transitions, weapons too long to maneuver in apartment buildings and refugee camp corridors. Precious seconds lost that translated into wounds and deaths. In October 2000, a young lieutenant named Eli Barak wrote a letter to the IDF Chief of Staff. Barak had trained with a Tavor prototype during an unofficial evaluation. His letter was blunt. "Sir, we are losing people because our rifles don't fit the battle space. There is a weapon that solves this problem. It exists. It works. We need it now, not after the next board meeting." The letter went nowhere officially, but it circulated among junior officers, became photocopied samizdat, a voice for tactical reality against institutional inertia. Shebs received a copy in November. He pinned it to the workshop wall, next to casualty statistics and test data, a reminder of why the work continued when every rational calculation said to quit. By early 2002, the tactical situation in the West Bank had deteriorated to crisis levels. Palestinian militant organizations, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, launched waves of suicide bombings in Israeli cities. The IDF response was Operation Defensive Shield, the largest military operation in the West Bank since the Six-Day War. Central to this operation was Jenin, a refugee camp that had become a stronghold for militant fighters. The camp was a tactical nightmare. Narrow alleys, barely 2 meters wide, multi-story buildings with interlocking fields of fire, a civilian population of 14,000 mixed with an estimated 200 armed combatants. The operation began in April 2002. Within the first 48 hours, Israeli forces had lost 13 soldiers, many in close-quarters engagements, where room-to-room fighting gave no quarter and every doorway was potentially fatal. The casualty reports reached IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv like distress calls from a sinking ship. On April 5th, a desperate decision was made. Colonel Yaron Amit, the same officer who'd examined the Tavor prototype in 1995 and called it a broken toy, authorized an emergency field trial. Duvdevan, an elite special forces unit specializing in urban counter-terrorism, would receive 15 Tavor prototypes. No formal training beyond basic familiarization, no extensive testing protocols. Just issue the weapons and see if they survived combat. It was an act of institutional desperation, disguised as tactical pragmatism. Shebs got the call at 0300 on April 6th. "We need every functional Tavor you have," a logistics officer said. By noon. "How many?" 15. "Can you do it?" Shebs looked around the workshop. They had 11 complete rifles, 4 that needed final assembly. He had 8 hours. "Yes." He hung up and started making calls. Goldstein arrived within the hour. Hisson 20 minutes later. They pulled an all-nighter they'd pulled 100 times before, except this time it wasn't a test. This time, the rifles they were finishing would face the worst urban combat Israeli soldiers had encountered since 1948. By 1100, they had 15 Tavors packed in foam-lined cases. A military truck took them north. Shebs stood in the empty workshop, suddenly aware that everything, 7 years of work, career risk, family sacrifice, institutional resistance, had condensed into those 15 rifles heading toward Jenin. "They'll either work, or they won't," Goldstein said quietly. "They'll work," Shebs replied, but he touched the mezuzah on the workshop doorframe anyway, a gesture halfway between faith and superstition. In Jenin, the rifles were distributed to Duvdevan operators with minimal ceremony. Most had never seen a bullpup configuration before. The briefing was tactically blunt. Magazine goes here, selector switch here, ambidextrous charging handle. If it jams, fall back to sidearms. Questions? There were no questions. There was only the next building to clear, the next stairwell to ascend, the next room where someone might be waiting with an AK-47 or a suicide vest or both. The Tavor went to war. The Battle of Jenin refugee camp lasted 11 days. In the tactical history that would later be written, it would be remembered for urban fighting so intense that the IDF eventually resorted to armored bulldozers to create paths through buildings too dangerous to clear room by room. But in the immediate chaos of April 2002, there was no historical perspective, only the immediate tactical reality of soldiers moving through corridors of death. Sergeant David Mizrahi was among the first Duvdevan operators to carry the Tavor into combat. His after-action testimony, recorded 3 days into the operation, captured the weapon's impact. "We were clearing a 3-story building on the eastern edge of the camp, standard stack formation, but the stairwell was maybe 90 centimeters wide. With my M16, I'd have needed to cant the rifle vertically, lose sight picture, transition awkwardly at each landing. With the Tavor, I kept the muzzle forward, maintained sight alignment, rotated smoothly through the turns. The engagement came at the second-floor landing. Fighter in the doorway, maybe 2 meters away. I acquired, fired, confirmed, transitioned to the next room before my wingman even processed what happened. With my old rifle, I'd have been dead. The fighter would have shot me while I was repositioning." Similar reports came in from other Duvdevan units. Corporal Yael Navon described clearing a bathroom where the space between door and far wall measured 1.4 meters. Impossible to maneuver an M16, but adequate for the Tavor's compact profile. Lieutenant Oren Tal reported engaging a fighter through a window while positioned in a hallway so narrow he could touch both walls, a shot impossible with conventional rifle geometry. The most telling statistic: over 3 weeks of sustained urban combat, 15 Tavor prototypes fired approximately 42,000 rounds. 0 catastrophic mechanical failures. 3 minor issues: a stuck magazine release, a loose rail mount, a trigger spring that needed adjustment, all field repairable in minutes. The contrast with casualty projections was stark. Duvdevan units equipped with Tavors had significantly lower casualty rates in close-quarters engagements compared to conventional infantry using M16s and M4s. The numbers reached IDF General Staff by April 15th. On April 17th, Colonel Amit, who'd called the Tavor a broken toy 7 years earlier, appeared at the IMI workshop in Ramat Hasharon. Shebs was at his desk, reviewing stress test data on the X95 variant, when Amit walked in without knocking. "The weapon works," Amit said without preamble. "I know," Shebs replied. "You were right, we were wrong." Shebs set down his pen. This was the moment he'd imagined 1,000 times. Vindication, validation, the institutional acknowledgement that his 7-year crusade against doctrine had been correct. He'd expected it to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy. "How many soldiers died?" he asked quietly, "while you were deciding whether to believe me?" Amit was silent for a long moment. "Too many," he finally said, "which is why I'm here." The Chief of Staff wants full production evaluation, budget authorization, training protocol development, integration into standard infantry equipment, all of it. Starting now. The bureaucratic wheels, once frozen in resistance, suddenly began turning at emergency speed. What followed was a compressed timeline that would have been impossible without the Jenin combat data. In June 2002, the IDF conducted formal trials with 200 Tavors across multiple infantry brigades. By September, the first production contract was signed. By December, training facilities were being reconfigured to accommodate the new weapon system. But the adoption was far from smooth. Senior officers who'd built careers on conventional doctrine resisted. Procurement officials argued about logistics costs. Training NCOs complained about relearning fundamentals. The institutional antibodies that had kept the Tavor in limbo for 7 years didn't disappear simply because the weapon had proven itself. They just found new objections. The resistance took subtler forms. Budget allocations were delayed. Production schedules were under review. Training manual development moved at bureaucratic pace. The Tavor was approved, but not quite embraced, accepted, but not quite welcome. It took a second round of combat data to break the deadlock. In spring 2003, during operations in Gaza City, infantry units equipped with M16s and those equipped with Tavors operated in similar urban terrain. The difference in operational effectiveness was quantifiable. Tavor-equipped units completed building clearances 23% faster with 31% fewer casualties in close-quarters engagements. The numbers were irrefutable. By June 2003, the IDF formally adopted the Tavor TAR-21 as the standard infantry rifle for combat units. Shebs should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt exhausted. The night after the formal adoption announcement, he sat in the workshop, now significantly larger, officially budgeted, staffed with engineers who'd never known the years of secret development, and held one of the first production-line Tavors. It felt identical to the prototypes he'd built in 1995, but the weight seemed different somehow, heavier. Goldstein found him there around 2200. "You did it," she said. "You changed how we fight." "I prolonged how we fight," Shebs corrected. "The weapon doesn't end wars. It just changes the mathematics of who survives them. That's not nothing." "No, but it's not victory either." He thought about the soldiers in Jenin who'd carried his rifles into rooms where death waited. About the ones who'd survived because a weapon rotated 15 degrees faster in a confined space. About the ones who died anyway because war consumes people regardless of their equipment. The Tavor had proven itself. Doctrine had changed. But Shebs understood something that the celebration missed. Every innovation in warfare is simultaneously a success and a failure. Success because it solves a problem. Failure because the problem shouldn't have existed in the first place. "What happens now?" Goldstein asked. Now it spreads. Other countries will adopt it. The doctrine of urban combat will shift globally. The bullpup configuration will move from curiosity to standard. And somewhere, an engineer we'll never meet will develop something that makes the Tavor obsolete. And that doesn't bother you. Shebs smiled faintly. That's the point. Innovation isn't about creating permanent solutions. It's about solving the problem in front of you so someone else can solve the next one. Outside, Tel Aviv continued its endless rhythm. Inside the workshop, the first production Tavor sat on the workbench, symbol of 7 years' obsession, institutional resistance overcome, battlefield vindication achieved. It looked, Shebs thought, exactly like every other rifle. Metal and polymer, springs and pins, the accumulated mechanical wisdom of a century of firearms design. But hidden in those components was something more. The knowledge that doctrine can be wrong, that institutional wisdom can kill, that sometimes the most important thing an engineer can do is build what everyone says is impossible. The cost of that knowledge, missed recitals, strained marriage, burned faces from prototype failures, years of professional ridicule, seemed like a bargain. Or at least, that's what Shebs told himself as he turned off the workshop lights and headed home to a family that had learned to live with his absence. The global adoption of the Tavor came in waves that surprised even its creators. India was first, in 2003. Their special forces, facing Kashmiri militants in the Warren-like streets of Srinagar, needed exactly what the Tavor offered: rifle-caliber firepower in submachine gun dimensions. They purchased 2,000 units and began domestic production negotiations. Georgia followed in 2007, preparing for conflict with Russia in South Ossetia, Ukraine in 2014, as urban warfare in Donetsk demanded weapons optimized for building clearance. Colombia, fighting FARC insurgents in jungle villages. The Philippines, combating Abu Sayyaf in dense tropical urban terrain. By 2010, variations of the Tavor were in service across 37 countries. The bullpup configuration, once dismissed as impractical curiosity, had become standard doctrine for urban counterinsurgency operations worldwide. But success carried its own burdens. In 2014, footage emerged from Nigeria showing Boko Haram militants armed with captured Tavors. The weapons had been taken from Nigerian security forces, who'd acquired them specifically for urban anti-terrorism operations. Seeing his design in the hands of those he'd never intended to arm shook Shebs in ways he hadn't anticipated. In a rare interview with Haaretz, he addressed it directly. You create something to protect your people, and then you realize that any tool can be perverted. A hammer builds houses and breaks skulls. The moral weight doesn't lie in the tool. It lies in the hands that hold it. But that doesn't make it easier to watch. The interviewer pressed, did he regret creating the Tavor? No, Shebs answered after a long pause. Because I remember the soldiers in Jenin. I remember the letters from operators who told me they survived a firefight because their weapon fit the space they were fighting in. That's not abstract, that's real. The fact that evil exists and will use whatever tools it can find, that's not an argument against innovation. It's an argument for ensuring good people have the best tools available. By then, Shebs had been retired from IMI for 5 years. He lived in a modest house in Netanya, a coastal town 40 minutes north of Tel Aviv. His daily routine involved tending a small vegetable garden, reading technical journals, and occasionally consulting for defense startups who sought his perspective on design philosophy. Rachel had stayed with him, though the marriage bore the scars of his years of obsession. They'd found a fragile equilibrium, affection tempered by distance, companionship marked by the awareness of what had been sacrificed for a cause she'd never fully understood. His children had grown into adults, with lives that occasionally intersected his. Sarah, the daughter whose recital he'd missed, worked as a physician in Jerusalem. His son, Michael, taught computer science at Ben-Gurion University. They called on holidays, visited for Shabbat dinners, maintained the rhythms of family while acknowledging the gaps that couldn't be bridged retroactively. The weapons industry had moved on. The Tavor X95, third generation, further refined, was now standard issue for IDF infantry. Newer technologies competed for attention: smart optics, lightweight armor systems, drone integration. The innovation that had consumed Shebs's life had become routine, its revolutionary character absorbed into institutional normalcy. Most of the original team had scattered. Baruch Lev had died of pancreatic cancer in 2012, his funeral attended by engineers and soldiers who remembered his contributions to ergonomic design. David Meron worked on desalination technology, applying materials expertise to civilian infrastructure. Eddie Goldstein led renewable energy projects, her ballistics knowledge translated into wind turbine optimization. Only Yoav Hassan remained in defense work, now a senior director at Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, occasionally sending Shebs photos of new prototypes with the caption, "Still fighting the good fight." In 2018, a military historian named Dr. Tamar Levinson contacted Shebs for an oral history project on Israeli defense innovation. They met at a cafe in Netanya, overlooking the Mediterranean. "Most people don't know your name," Dr. Levinson said. "They know the Tavor, but not the mind behind it." "That's appropriate," Shebs replied. "Weapons should be remembered. Engineers don't need to be. But you changed how wars are fought. You challenged doctrine when everyone said you were wrong. That's historically significant." Shebs sipped his coffee, watching waves break against the seawall. "I solved a problem that shouldn't have existed. Soldiers were dying because their equipment didn't match their battlefield. I created a tool that reduced that mismatch. That's engineering, not heroism. But it took 7 years of resistance. You risked your career, your family, your professional reputation. For what? For the possibility that a soldier I'd never meet might survive a firefight in a stairwell because his rifle was 7 inches shorter. That possibility seemed worth the cost. Was it? Another long pause. The question had haunted Shebs for years, the missed recitals and strained marriage, the colleagues who'd thought him obsessive, the nights of sleep lost to prototype failures, balanced against casualty statistics that would never fully account for lives saved. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I know that people who carried the Tavor came home who might not have otherwise. I know that doctrine changed because reality demanded it. Whether my personal sacrifices were proportional to those outcomes, I don't think that calculation has a clear answer." Dr. Levinson's book, published in 2020, devoted 3 chapters to the Tavor development saga. It sold modestly, read primarily by military technology enthusiasts and defense policy specialists. Shebs received a complimentary copy, but never read beyond the introduction. The story felt simultaneously too personal and too distant. Someone else's life, lived by a younger version of himself he no longer fully recognized. In 2023, the Israeli Defense Ministry announced the Tavor would remain in service through at least 2035, with continuous upgrades and modernization, 50,000 units in active service, exported variants numbering in the hundreds of thousands globally. Shebs learned about it from a news notification on his phone while pruning tomato plants in his garden. He sat on a weathered bench, dirt under his fingernails, the Mediterranean sun warm on his face. Somewhere in the world, a soldier was checking a Tavor before patrol. In a workshop somewhere, an engineer was refining the design further. In a staff meeting somewhere, officers were discussing urban combat doctrine shaped by innovations that had once been called impossible. The weapon had become infrastructure, its revolutionary origins forgotten in the machinery of daily military operations. And Zalman Shebs, the mind behind the weapon, tended his garden in quiet obscurity, which was, he'd come to believe, exactly as it should be. That evening, Rachel found him at his workbench in the garage. Not the official IMI workshop, just a small space with a lathe and hand tools where he occasionally built small mechanisms for grandchildren or repaired neighbors' appliances. "You're thinking about it again," she said. "Always," he admitted. "Regrets, plenty, but not about the weapon. About the cost to you, to the children, to us." She sat beside him, their shoulders touching in the gathering dusk. "You couldn't have done differently," she said, "not and still been yourself. Some people are built to accept limits. You were built to question them. That sounds like absolution I haven't earned. It's observation, not absolution. You paid the price for being right when everyone said you were wrong. So did we. Whether that was worth it, I don't know if that question has an answer." They sat in silence, the kind married people achieve after decades of navigation through shared compromise and separate sacrifices. In a drawer of the workbench, wrapped in oilcloth, was a component from the first successful Tavor prototype, a trigger assembly that had survived every iteration and now served as a memento of 7 years' obsession. Shebs occasionally took it out, felt its weight, remembered the nights of failure and the mornings of incremental progress, but on that evening in 2023, he left it wrapped. The work was done. The weapon existed. Doctrine had changed. Lives had been saved, and lives had been lost, and the mathematics of warfare had shifted incrementally in favor of those who fought in urban spaces where every inch mattered. Whether that constituted success, victory, or simply the substitution of one set of problems for another, Shebs no longer knew. And increasingly he suspected that uncertainty was the only honest conclusion. In the end, it wasn't the Tavor that endured in his memory. It was the moment in 1991 when he'd chosen to question doctrine, the nights in workshops when doubt warred with certainty, the casualties reports that had driven him forward when every rational voice said to quit. The weapon was steel and polymer. The memory was human, fragile, conflicted, costly, and irreplaceable. Outside, the Mediterranean continued its ancient rhythm. Inside, 2 people who'd survived the cost of innovation sat together in the growing darkness, Not quite reconciled, not quite regretful, simply present in the knowledge that some questions have no satisfactory answers and some achievements carry burdens that persist long after the celebration ends. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What price would you pay to be right when everyone insists you're wrong?